joining us today for this webinar on connecting teachers and families, mental health and social emotional supports in the remote and hybrid classroom. My name is Emily Scahill. I'm the Manager of Public Education and Awareness at Mental Health America's National Office, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Some notes before I introduce you to our presenters. All participants are muted and unable to turn on your microphones. We are recording this webinar, and I will send that out to everyone along with the slides within 1 week. And we don't offer CEUs, but are happy to provide a certificate of attendance upon request. I will post the link to request one in the chat today, and I will include it in our follow-up email as well. And last but not least, we've built in some time for a Q&A at the end. So drop any questions in the chat throughout, and we'll go through some at the end. And like I said, feel free to use the chat box to say hi and let us know where you're from, as well as make comments throughout the presentation. And now I'm so excited to introduce today's speakers, Adam Lustig and Leah Kieo. Adam Lustig is currently the director for the National School Board Association Center for Safe Schools, an NSBA initiative to support and ensure a safe and secure environment for students, staff, and community members. Adam began his career in New York City public schools as a teacher and varsity baseball and basketball coach. He then continued his work in New York City in the Office of School Wellness Programs, and finally as an assistant principal at John Dewey High School, where he oversaw safety and security, school climate, physical education, health education, and athletics. He also worked in Washington, D.C. public schools, where he managed social and emotional learning, school climate, student behavior, restorative justice, and bullying prevention for all 115 DCPS schools. Throughout his various roles, Adam has also served as a professional development trainer at the state, district, and school levels. The experience he has gained through this work has shaped his belief that school safety goes far beyond just focusing only on security measures or individual programs. With this, it is essential that school communities take an intentional shift from reactive to preventative measures, focusing on supporting the whole child while also purposefully engaging families and communities. Leah Kieo is the CEO and founder of With Respect. She holds a BA in psychology and an MS in education and special education. She designs and delivers tools and strategies that create and nurture respect and resilience within individuals and organizations. Her work develops and nurtures resilience, respect, and agency in systems and the cultures that drive them by empowering the people that work within them. As an educator and trainer, Leah has been sharing for over 20 years, empowering learners to own their learning, grow their dreams, and achieve beyond what anyone thinks is possible, including themselves. She shares from her own experience in trauma, poverty, and as a classroom teacher. Her work is about tools and strategies that are culturally relevant and immediately applicable. She offers wisdom, engages with curiosity, and learns alongside children and adults. After all, we are all simultaneously teachers and learners. And with that, I will turn it over to Adam and Leah to get us started.
All right, great. Thank you, Emily. So, thank you all for joining us today. I'm very excited to be a part of the conversation and work with this with Mental Health America. I'm going to get into the background of National School Boards Association, our Center for Safe Schools, in a little bit. But just to give some brief background, we started back in May of 2019, and Mental Health America is one of the first organizations that we were able to link up with and collaborate with. And we've had a really great experience so far, so really happy to be part of this conversation with Leah and with Mental Health America today. What we're going to get into today is we're going to lean into the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, which, as we know, has forced many schools to shift to remote or hybrid instruction models. These unprecedented times are impacting all areas of our nation and creating new challenges for our schools and communities on a daily basis. Among other challenges, physical isolation is amplifying existing as well as creating new mental health concerns. And current events, if nothing else, have shown us the need to go beyond our traditional notions of how we educate and support our students and families. This is no easy task, and the struggles our communities are facing to meet the needs of our students and of our families is most certainly real. With this in mind, this presentation is going to focus on the role that mental health supports play within the social emotional development of students during the remote and hybrid instruction. And you can see our session objectives here, but we'll get into the needs that show up with remote and hybrid learning for our students, why we need to respond to those needs, and the importance of social emotional development in those roles, tools for effective and productive communication for teachers and families, link up to understand the needs of the students and best meet them in these challenging times. And again, what are the next steps in implementing, understanding the language, the tools to support the effective communication between teachers and families. Very quick background just on National School Boards Association. If you're not familiar with us, we are actually a federation of 49 state school board associations, all except for Hawaii. They operate a little differently. And we also have the U.S. Virgin Islands as one of our members. So our states are essentially our membership that we work with. And what we do is we represent the locally elected school board officials who serve approximately 50 million public school students. We are essentially, the way we're looked at is the DC office for all of those state associations that I mentioned. And we work with and through and for those state associations, advocating and providing supports for equity and excellence in public education through school board leadership. Back in 2019, we launched the Center for Safe Schools, which is what I oversee. And this really came about through a lot of conversations we were having with our state associations of just recognizing the growing field of school safety, how much content is coming out there, how much best practices and expectations, and they really needed support in kind of funneling and sifting through that information to really get the best practice and best information down to their membership and to the local level of the schools. So we launched, and our Center for Safe Schools is a little unique because if you go to our website, what we do is really open to everybody. So we try to be a liaison between the state associations and the communities and the local boards, but we also have resources that I think are really useful for absolutely anybody. Just to mention, if you go there, we had our first safety summit virtually back in September. That's all posted there and it's for free if you want to check it out. If you're interested in the social and emotional learning work, our keynote speaker was Dr. Mark Brackett, who founded the Center for Emotional Intelligence at Yale. So just a lot of resources that we think are just really helpful to get out there and really can start driving the conversation. And you know, really what it says up here, again, we want to provide that national forum and platform to really bring together everybody interested in these conversations around school safety, to have a place to have these conversations and learn and grow and support our students in our schools. We talk about school safety, it covers such a wide spectrum of content, obviously, so we try to just break it into these 4 areas just so you get a sense of how we operate, but we look at infrastructure, again, the physical aspects of school buildings and facilities, how do we safeguard against threats and attacks. Crisis and emergency management, we look at the detection, prevention, and management of critical events and emergencies. Cybersecurity, again, the full look of what we're seeing with the digital world, keeping our schools, our systems safe, but also educating students, families, and staff on how to operate safely in those spaces. And whole child health, again, just bringing together the child's physical, mental, social, emotional well-being, essential to achieve positive outcomes. Emily mentioned my background. I come from a social emotional background like Leah, so the lens I bring to this work is how do we really connect all of these areas, regardless of what we're talking about, what's the impact on the students? So even if we're talking about crisis and emergency management, are we doing that with a trauma-informed lens to not re-traumatize some of our students and that kind of lens? So really excited to be a part of this conversation today as we lean into the social emotional learning conversation. Emily briefly introduced Leah, but we're excited also, just going into that connection to whole child, we're really working to build out our relationships with other organizations that are really leading this work around the country and are very excited to start our work with Respect and with Leah. And really just she'll give a little background herself, but With Respect provides training, consulting, and coaching for solutions needed to develop and nurture safe and respectful environments, increase flexibility and competence through emotional intelligence, build positive, healthy relationships, navigate complex conflict and communication, and support resilience, agency, and effective trauma response. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Leah, and we're excited to get going.
Thanks, Adam. I'm excited to be here. Got a little bit of feedback going. Okay. And I'm as Adam said, I'm the CEO and founder of With Respect. And today we're going to dive into really understanding where we're at with things. So the first thing that ever has to happen is around awareness. And awareness is one of those things that we don't know we don't have it until we're faced with something we don't recognize. And today's a lot about awareness. So let's take a look at this video real quick just to get us started and kind of prime the pump.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
In this unprecedented world where virtual and hybrid learning and distance learning, as well as some of our schools still doing face-to-face learning, really becoming aware of what it's going to look like, because things now that we could get a sense of by being present, we really have to work at recognizing. So this awareness factor is huge in regards to the communication between families and educators. It's how we come together to understand when things aren't right. So what is typical, what is atypical? How does that look and what does it look like? Establishing that communication within those family units to be able to understand our students is probably the biggest issue around awareness. We don't know what we're looking for, and we all have a different series of expectations if we don't just kind of settle in to understand each other differently. The other cool thing about awareness, though, is once we are aware, we can't unknow. It's kind of like reading. Once we've learned how to read, we cannot look at letters put together into spaces without reading. So we're going to watch the video again and see if you can not see the moonwalking bear.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
So when we talk with parents, once we have the lens that we need to have that awareness, that lens will walk with us forward and we'll be able to see things we didn't know that we needed to see previously. Let's go to the next slide. The next step really is about interpretation. So this is our quick down and dirty behavior cognitive theory kind of a concept. First and foremost, behavior meets a need. All behavior meets a need. Yours, mine, the dogs, birds in the sky, bugs on the ground, everything is driven by need. And second of all, as long as that need is met, the behavior will not change. That's important because when I have a behavior in my environment that consistently moves forward, I have to question whether or not I am complicit in having that need met. The third part is behavior doesn't just stop. That's because it meets a need, right? Back to number one, it has to be replaced. So what we understand about behavior and this whole concept of need is significant because in typical behavior for anyone, right? When that typical behavior shifts, the need has changed. So that's what we need to be able to understand. Behavior is another form of communication. So if I have a student who behaves one way one day and a different way the second day, then we really have to remember that the need changed. And we have to, as educators, be ready to adapt to that need. That only happens through that communication mechanism with families, knowing what that need might be, how we might approach that need. This is where the conversation with family helps us to be able to understand and interpret behavior. As we look at and move forward, go ahead and click the next slide, please. We have to understand the other thing big thing about behavior is we don't want to label it. We need to describe it. If I say someone's using aggressive behavior, my aggressive and your aggressive may or may not be the same thing. So we have to really think about descriptions. Can you click for me? This table and the slides will be available for you, so you'll have this as a resource. So I'm not going to go through all of these details, but I want you to recognize that withdrawal in face-to-face could be a physical removal of self. It can actually, increase absence. When we see that in virtual, it's a high absenteeism where kids just aren't showing up. We may see typically talkative and engaged kids are now quiet and disengaged. And unengaged and disengaged in virtual can be everything from video off, looking off screen. It's you ask a question and they seem to be lost, lack of participation, constantly on mute, not willing to participate. So recognizing how we can describe behavior so that when a parent says, my child has anxiety, we are driving to the description. That's how we're going to understand the behavior. We aren't going to get it through our own interpretation of anxiety. So this communication component of clarity around what we mean regarding behavior is going to be crucial. How do I know when a student is behaving typically, is currently engaged? So it's an important concept to wrap our brain around as we step into that communication component. Next slide, please. This is all about social emotional development. So recognizing how we communicate social emotional skills and creating resilience within that. This is the resiliency sphere that With Respect has created and that we use to teach to both with students, with staff and professional development around coaching, all of that idea of how we talk about it. All students benefit from us being able to utilize this. So as a tool and thinking about how we set our classrooms up, whether they are virtual or face-to-face or a hybrid, how do we set our classrooms up so that they are establishing that sense of safety? And the sphere gives us the depth of which we can do this, right? So that sense of safety is established through high expectations. Goes through clear boundaries, growth mindset, strengths-based consistency, so that we get to that positive, caring adult, so that is unknown to a student, right? Recognizing how this sphere informs the process. And students with mental health diagnoses often need these skills reinforced and or skills and tools so that they actually can connect with them. Sense of self, self-regulation. This is we've seen this in the zones of regulation kinds of SEL curriculum, etc. Teaching kids how to recognize what they feel, how to identify it, and how to get their needs met. How it is that I can feel very, very highly in, really, really escalated, but I can still behave and ask for my needs to be met in a way that is not at that same level of escalation. That's all that self-regulation, self-management, sense of purpose, confidence, self-care, and agency. How do we help kids do that so that we're doing it with all students? By doing it with all students, we, one, do not call attention to any single student. Resilience is one of those things that we benefit from before, during, after trauma, and beyond. Having these skills in our toolbox is crucial to being able to teach these concepts to our kids. Relationships is the next level, right? Everything from friendship and conflict to communication, inter and intrapersonal, helping us with healthy relationships, healthy attachment, which helps us to develop our trust. And lastly, the adaptive capacity. This is, we're ultimately driving to get to flexible thinking, right? Problem solving, perseverance, critical thinking, reframing, and the ability to take action. How we encompass this within our classrooms benefits not only those students who have with mental health, but also those who are typically developing and or those that may fall through the cracks at some other time. Click, please, to the next slide. So why do positive social emotional development for all students? Click. First and foremost, it supports healthy development for all of the students. Second of all, click. It models diversity in the classroom. So not only am I modeling that diversity exists within the classroom, but I, as a teacher, am modeling how we can diversify, how we respond and interact with each other based on differences, with respect, and with that idea of growth mindset, all of the resiliency concept. And it gives us an opportunity to click, model, and teach empathy and respect. And these are by far probably the biggest learning, social emotional learnings that we need to be able to both model and teach. Empathy is something that is learned. We aren't born with empathy. And research has given a strong indication that we can teach empathy from a very young age. So recognizing what is it that I support, do within a classroom, within conversation in families, what are the tools that I'm using in my classroom? The best part of this is that the social emotional development that I'm doing in classrooms, I can also give to parents so that they are also reinforcing and using the same language, the same tools in the household as well. This gives them the opportunity to have new tools in their toolbox, recognize how to give them to their students, and support and reinforce what's happening in the school environment. One more click. In the big picture, how can we really go wrong with being able to build on this resilience at a classroom level so that we are picking up all of our students, recognizing that these are skills and tools that we possess, that we transfer to our, that we teach and model for our students, that we also then give to our families and caregivers so that they're reinforcing those in the home environment. We have within our organization the idea of how everything has to come from self, right? So thinking about how modeling means I have to possess it, okay? Next slide, please. Click. So the first thing about effective communication is to recognize that we don't know what we don't know until we are taught what we need to know. That's why we teach first. And we have to teach ahead of time. We have to teach before we need it. We teach self-regulation and self-management in calm, predictable environments. It's sort of like dealing with a drunk, right? Once a drunk is drunk, the chances are we are not going to be able to do much with them. Once we are engaged then in a crisis, in a trauma, or in a moment of need is when we're reminding about the skills and tools we have taught. And then when it's all over, we want to review and take the opportunity to reteach what worked, what didn't work. And so the other second part of this is that we really, really need to stay curious with our families when we're talking with our students and with ourselves. That means we're asking questions, constantly asking questions, because what happens is when we are asking questions, we stay in the frontal cortex of our brain, in the part of our brain that we use to respond. When we are in our reactive brain, we're in our lower brain, our limbic brain, where we're very much more into our fight, flight, or freeze, our survival. When we move into that curiosity, that asking questions, we also allow the person with whom we are interacting to move into their frontal cortex. We give them time to respond, to answer a question. We keep it at that question, curiosity level. Help me understand. What can you tell me about? Keeping in mind that when we engage with parents, caregivers, and families, they are the experts on that child. We need whatever they've got in their heads, and sometimes they don't even know how much they know. By being able to stay in that curiosity and ask those questions, we actually pull out some of those pieces of things they don't even recognize are going on. So staying curious is a huge component in effective communication. Can I have a click, please? And one more. We need to avoid shame, blame, and judgment language. Our social language in the United States is riddled with phrases that we all grew up with that are just laden with this shame, blame, and judgment concept. Think about it. Things like that make you feel like someone's pointing at you. How could you? What did you do? I'm so disappointed in you, right? All of those yous are very pointed. They feel like I am being attacked. We know when we have triggered someone's reaction, right, to a shame, blame, or judgment statement when they become defensive, when they start to blame or deflect, when they are lying, when they withdraw, when all of a sudden their social skills crash, right? All of that is very linked to shame, blame, and judgment language. The cool thing is, if we stay in curiosity, we are less likely to slide into that shame, blame, and judgment language. And language is powerful. How we use language formulates the stories we tell. And as educators, as parents, we are helping kids to write their story. So we want to be extremely aware of the language that we're using, particularly around who children are, how effective they are, how well they can master and manage themselves within any environment. So this effective communication is crucial. Remembering that oftentimes families have an experience of not being listened to. They have an experience of having educators telling them what is right. I'll never forget, as the parent of an emotionally behaviorally challenged child, he was in 5th grade when the first time I ever got a phone call was from his classroom teacher. And I got on the phone and I was defensive. I was ready for whatever was going to come my way. And he started the conversation with, I really want you to help me understand your son because obviously I'm not getting it right. He and I are having a lot of issues. I didn't have words for the first few minutes, right? Recognizing how powerful it is to come in with those questions, to recognize that the expert is the parent, is the caregiver, right? Now we have empowered, we have empowered them. We've also created a really, really strong foundation for a good relationship, and that between us and that family unit. That good relationship is going to go a long way, especially if things get a little bumpy along the way, right? So when behaviors begin to tank, as opposed to parents becoming defensive and afraid of how a school will respond, they can lean into you to be able to understand what you're doing in a classroom that might be helpful. The other big part to kind of keep in the back of your brain is that when we are delivering new tools, it takes a whole lot of practice to get those tools greased well and working. So what opportunities are we providing not just to our students to practice, but our parents and caregivers as well? So food for thought around that. Can we click? Most importantly, when we are in communication, we want to lead with the need. If at all times when I am in communication, I remember that behavior is driven by a need, that staying curious allows me to dig for that need. So recognizing how those two go together. As a parent, I had a situation where we had 4 teenagers, 1 car. Standard rule was whoever put gas in the car got to drive. They went to school about 40 miles away. So one afternoon, there were 3 boys and a girl. The daughter had put gas in the car. Oldest brother was like, I want to drive. And she was like, I put gas in the car. And he's like, I want to drive. She said, I put gas in the car. He stormed away. She drove home minus a brother. By the time she got home and I figured out what had happened, it was about 2 hours since I knew where my kid was. So I started making phone calls to friends, and they either weren't home or hadn't seen him. It was a small town, so I called over to the police and I said, hey, I haven't seen Max. Can you just cruise around? Oh, we know where he hangs out. Within 15 minutes, I get a phone call, right? Are you calling the cops on me for, right? I'm leading with the need. I love you. You could be dead in a ditch somewhere. I didn't know where you were, right? That effective communication eliminated the conflict that was going to go on right there. And I got to be able to have a conversation to figure out where he was, how he was getting home, all of those details. Wouldn't have gotten there if I had reacted to that need instead of leading with that need. And again, this is something that requires some practice and figuring out where our opportunities are for that practice. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So now what are we going to do? This spiral is what we call selfish altruism. If you look, everything begins where that red asterisk is. It begins with the I. I have to understand me, how I function. It also means that that empathy and compassion that we're modeling, I have to have that for myself first. Then I can move into my we, which is my interpersonal relationships, and then I can apply that to my community, which is the us. And it always comes back to the I. When I remember that I can only give what I've got, can't give what I ain't got, if I am struggling with a skill or a tool, then I really need to step into a place where I can learn that for myself. By developing my own professional self, my own personal self, I become a better teacher, I become a better parent, I become a better partner, I become a better citizen. So recognizing how important this is. This is also crucial because it's true for all people, right? Not just I, but also for students, for families. How do I communicate to families to make sure that they have the resources that they need, that they have access to those tools, that especially if I'm teaching them, how can I make those most accessible to parents and family as well as community? So thinking that through, how that looks, what it looks like, and how we want to be able to embrace that. So the other big thing is we want to remember to stay curious. No matter what's going on, whether things are going right or going wrong, or anything in the middle, because that's a whole spectrum and a circle, right? We want to keep in mind that that remaining curious is the biggest thing. Because one, that's how I grow my eye, right? I'm like, well, this happened. I don't understand how that happened. Let me go ask questions over here, right? Let me ask my colleagues. Let me check in with parents. Let me ask my students, right? All of those things allow me to stay curious, to continue to grow my eye, and to engage in a way that is empowering and engaging with other people. And the other really big piece of this is we have to maintain an open mind and an open heart. By being able to step into our own vulnerability, we offer people the biggest gift that we can, because that's where we are most authentic in how we are interacting with a variety of different people. How does that look? As we share with our families and community, we continue to improve that communication. We become more comfortable with each other. And within that comfort level, there will be times when conflict arises. Being sure that you've got conflict tools, being sure that you have the ability to be able to engage in difficult conversations, that you have the ability to be able to maintain your own sense of self, even if someone is kind of blaming you or coming at you. How do you manage that within yourself? Those are all skills and tools that allow us to be able to stand in that place of curiosity, keep an open mind and an open heart. I did catch one of the questions in the chat asking about the we. I'm going to go through the spiral a little bit more in more detail. At the center is I. Everything starts with I. Who am I, right? From there, I move to we. Who am I when I'm in relationship with other people? Who are we when I'm in relationship with us? Those interpersonal relationships create the us. Us is our community. And so each of those interpersonal relationships create that social circle. In the case of what we're talking about, that can be family units can be the us. Classrooms can be the us. Communities can be the us. All of that sort of idea. Now, the other significant thing about this is to recognize that from us, we go back to I. The I redevelops itself, if you will, about every 3 years. This is an indigenous model of development as opposed to the much more Western linear model of development. Everything starts in the I. So it is this idea of I develops around the threes, the age of 3, the age of 13, 23, 33, 43. And if you think about it, right, we are establishing who we are in different environments, which then changes oftentimes who we are interacting with in our we, and then that changes who we interact with in our us. At 3, we're in preschool, right? Our we is our preschool mates, our teachers in that environment. That us becomes that classroom. As opposed to by the time we're 13, we're in a whole different environment, right? So that recognition of this is a breath from the inside out, and that's our development, okay? One more click, please. When we embrace this idea of empathy and compassion, it's important to understand the differences in the steps to getting to compassion. Sympathy, I care about your suffering. Empathy, I feel your suffering. And compassion, I want to do something about your suffering, okay? I often say compassion is the action of feeling empathy. And when we recognize how these differ, it helps us to step into a different place with families. As we engage in conversation, sympathy oftentimes can lead to enablement, and we do not want to enable, right? Empathy and compassion is where we get to the empowerment components, because it's the, yeah, I feel ya, it sucks, and let me help you figure out how to make this better, right? So thinking about this process and how it all connects with this idea of I, we, us, and with the idea of behavior, okay? I am open and ready for questions.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. So yes, we do have some time for questions. Like I said, everyone, you're all welcome to submit your questions in the chat box. And we do have a few to start with. So number 1, how do we get teachers to understand that completing all assignments might not be a priority or even possible when a student is dealing with high anxiety or severe depression?
I think this is where we step into that space of empathy and compassion. Teachers are being called upon to make adjustments in a lot of different areas right now. And how do we help them to understand that the physicality of assignments is not the indicator of mastery? And it's a conversation of people over policy, for lack of better words, right? And it's stepping into that empathy space that says, I know this is how we've always done that, but this student has different needs. Behavior is driven from needs. So let's talk about the behaviors that we want and how we get those needs, even if it has to look different for this student. So thinking about it as coming from that behavior, from that need, lead with the need, and that would be my best recommendation.
Yeah, I think I'm going to chime in also, Leah, and I think looking kind of more at the macro level is it's not enough to think that our teachers need to own this. If schools and districts are incorporating social emotional practices and expecting parents and families to do the same, it needs to come from all areas within that district. So in areas struggling with that, I would question what is the messaging and what kind of supports are going to staff in these cases, in these challenging times. Are we checking on their emotional well-being as well? And are we utilizing this type of communication from the top down to the staff as well? So it's modeling throughout. You know, our students model adult behavior. It's the same thing. If we're really embodying this as a district, we need to be modeling it in all areas, not just putting it on the teachers and the staff and expecting them to figure it out from there. But you know, Leah's points are spot on. So thank you.
Yeah, and thinking about what kinds of needs the teachers have as well.
And a question from the teacher's end of things. How do we engage and use positive communication if we can't even get families to engage, even with trusted staff, like families that aren't logging on to classes?
We have to get creative. I have seen some teachers doing some really amazing things, everything from dropping postcards in the mail and creating almost a pen pal system. And again, it depends on the age range of the parents you're interacting with. How media savvy are they? Are there other mediums that you can address? Are there connections to those people that you can use? So you're not triangulating, but it is the, hey, I know you have contact with this person Can you help me get in touch with them directly? So finding different creative ways to be able to make that engagement. And the other part of it is that, remember, just as teachers are overwhelmed right now, our parents and families are saturated. And so they need things that don't feel like one more thing. And the more we can be supportive, empathetic, and compassionate, the more willing they're going to be to allow us to reach in.
Great. And then a few asking if you could elaborate on the concept lead with need.
Whenever I'm engaging in a conversation, particularly if it's I don't expect it to go particularly well, or it's on a topic that might be a little touchy, I'm considering in the back of my brain, what's the need on the other side of the table? As I consider that, I can craft my language to be able to come in and test to see if I'm right? So is that the need or isn't it? Or I can directly ask, right? So an example is a parent who sits down and says, right, I've got a student who really needs you to X, Y, or Z. So I'm going to come in through the door and say, and what I think I hear is that you need your student to succeed, and this is how you feel like we can make them successful. I've now asked a question, opened a door, and really provided a level of support without promising anything, right? So it's that recognition of how do we engage when we lead with that need. That's the first thing that's in my mind all the time. What's the need in front of me? What does this individual need? When I'm teaching in a classroom, right? It's I'm watching a kid become unengaged. Is it a momentary disengagement because nobody is 100% engaged all the time? Or is this, we're suddenly veering off? What do I need to do? What's this kid's need? How do I pull that kid back? Those sorts of things, that's leading with the need.
Great. And then a more specific question. So a lot of students are apprehensive to share their mental well-being when they know that their parents or other family members might be able to hear them from a few rooms over. So do you have any recommendations or tips on how to create a safe environment for students to share their feelings while in a virtual space?
One of the things that we have done is create a variety of self-portraits. So they are, we talk, it's part of the self-regulation, right? So similar to, so in the zones kind of a thing, we identify whether we're in a red zone, a green zone, yellow zone. This also gives kids the opportunity to create what their faces, what they look like, right? And so then silently, as things are sliding, they can put that up to the camera, and they now have a piece of paper that silently conveys to the instructor what's going on for them. And oftentimes all it takes is a nod, and now we can move things into chat. We can, there's all sorts of ways based on the age group that you're working with that we can begin to pull that off so that it isn't quite as threatening in a virtual environment. Again, when we create those different self-portraits, we're in a neutral zone. It's not a time period where we are escalated. This is done ahead of time, and we practice with them, so all right, everybody, I want you to show me what it looks like, right, if you're happy, right? So based on what age level I'm working with, I'm going to practice those skills.
Great. So let's see. When you're up against the wall from the state and government to perform academically, it makes it hard for schools not to focus on academics before emotions. What can schools do with that in mind?
It's not an either. When we build these together, when we create classroom environments, whether it's virtual or physical, where both of those things happen. And when you think about the opportunity of learning just in vocabulary, right, for emotion, right, let alone the deep dive that we can do based on those pieces. We all take time for classroom management. If our classroom management is social emotional based, then we've got that component going for us already. So it's not an either or. And it helps us when we realize and recognize that social emotional living happens every single day, every single moment. In this moment now, we are all engaged in social emotional living within ourselves, within the environment and the interactions that we have going on both on camera, off camera, etc. right now. So it's not, you can't pull those two worlds apart. What happens though is that kids who are emotionally grounded, who have that strong idea of who they are and how to manage themselves, they perform better academically. So it's an important building block in student success. And we need to recognize it's not an and, they're all at the same time.
Great. And then a question on empathy. So a parent said that my son gets agitated when I'm anxious and ends up getting mad at me, and also feels anxious when his friends are in trouble. I'm seeing now that he has compassion, but how do I help him feel less anxious and be able to productively empathize without taking on too much for himself?
I think that some difference between sympathize and empathize. So when we sympathize is when we are standing in a place that we want to make it all better, right? We want to do absolutely everything we can to alleviate it. I see your suffering. Empathy is, I feel what you're feeling. And when we move into compassion, we want to do something effective. What is the do? And so empathy and compassion need to be taught. So for example, in many communities, if there's a family death, right, neighbors will bring food over to that house while people are in a grieving state. That's something that's been learned, passed down as a tradition within that community. How do we teach compassion? So when someone else is in trouble, right, what is it that I can do that's compassionate? I can say things like, yeah, we all screw up, you're a good person anyway, right? So we can begin to model those things to be able to actually teach those skills and not just think that they're going to come up with them on their own. I hope that helps and answers that question.
Great. And if there's no cultural competency training for teachers, school professionals, how can they ensure that their interpretation is correct and not their bias showing up?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I think that part of what is in play right there is what we have come to understand is negative implicit bias, right? How do I know when my negative implicit bias is in play? It's not something I can learn by myself. It has to be done in community. That's a great question. On the slide that's up now, you have my email address. I'd love to engage in that conversation. I'm happy to deep dive into that. I'm not sure we have quite enough time to go there, but there are lots of pieces of what you're really kind of diving into, and whether cultural competence is the right idea and whether or not we're looking for cultural relevance. So all of those interesting nuances, I'd love to have that conversation.
Great. You mentioned the Indigenous model of development. Can you elaborate on that?
So I am Blackfoot, and Indigenous people believe in a solid development of self as a foundation. My people, I shouldn't say all Indigenous, but my people, and that idea of how do we strongly develop who people are so that as they move out into the world, they are, their experience adds to who they are, doesn't threaten who they are. And again, happy to have that conversation in depth. Nice question, thank you.
Great, and it looks like we have one last one for now, so if anyone else has other questions, get those in soon. How can you conduct effective group sessions remotely with children that have behavior issues or educational disabilities?
It's about accommodation and how we adapt and what is the adaptation. It's hard to answer the question without a specific example, but if I have a student who has specific needs, I'm going to put them into a group where the students within that group are going to be able to understand the adaptation. They don't necessarily have to accommodate it, that's my job, but they understand the adaptation and can work with it. An example, if I've got a group of 5 kids and I have 2, it's a reading group, right? We're gonna talk about a story we've read. I have 5 kids, but 2 of them have read a book that is at a lower grade level reading than the other 3. the 3 people that I'm putting them with recognize and how to be able to be supportive of that adaptation without making it a big deal. So they're not going to say, well, but you didn't read the same book I read, right? Those sorts of things that I'm taking into strong consideration. So that idea of how I'm intentionally grouping. There are other mechanisms. With behavior, I'm all about how do we teach self-management and what does self-management look like? I believe in building toolboxes for individual kids, all kids, not just kids with special needs. And then we can talk about what tools do you need to be able to use right now? Classrooms have that common language so kids can remind each other to use their tools as well. Those kinds of things that can help to reinforce and support group environments.
Great. And it looks like one last one. How can the parents encourage their children to participate more in class Zooms if they're resistant or anxious about it?
How do we normalize it? And that becomes the question. Remembering that those feelings are being driven by generally a need, right? There's something in there that's tickling that anxiety, that's tickling that resistance. Really sitting down to have that heart-to-heart conversation of what is it you don't like? Well, I don't like the camera. Well, what about the camera don't you like? Well, it's on my face. So, and with Zoom, there's the ability to be able to turn the camera off so that you don't see yourself, but everybody else can see you. Those sorts of technology things that we can play around with that can help kids in that situation. You've got some kids where their problem of engagement isn't theirs. It's the educational staff, right? Teachers aren't providing engaging material, hard to be engaged, right? So then the conversation turns to the adult world where we say, okay, so what can we do differently? How can we as parents reinforce and support the learning that you're trying to get to happen? So I think that it's an in-depth answer and an in-depth question.
Great. Looks like that's it. So we'll wrap there unless Leah or Adam, do you have any last words?
The only other thing I want to mention is that I like to be a resource for people. And so if you are interested in having a conversation, if you're interested in asking some questions, I'm wide open to having all of that come in. You've got my email address and my website.
Yep, I'll just second that. I want to thank Emily again for inviting us today and being able to be part of this conversation. And like I said, we're trying to be a resource for everybody out there. We focus on school boards, but again, the ultimate impact is within our schools and in our communities. So please check out our stuff, and if there's any way that we can assist, any additional questions you have, don't hesitate to reach out.
Great.
Thank you, Emily. I appreciate
both for a wonderful presentation, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. I'll be in touch with everyone in the next few days to get you all the recording and a copy of the slides, as well as that link to request a certificate of attendance. Stay safe and healthy and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.